Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. In the comments, let me know where you're watching from before we start. This is a story that has been passed down from generation to generation. It is hidden in misty mountains and thick woods, where silence holds old secrets. It's 1913 in the highlands of North Carolina. People were still having a hard time getting to the deep valleys and winding trails that linked small, isolated towns. Ellen Crowe, who was 28 years old, was known as people in Madison County know her for being good at using medicinal herbs and old-fashioned treatments. She was born and raised in the mountains and knew every plant, stream, and rock structure in the land her family had lived on. She lived by herself in a wooden cabin on the French Broad River, on land that she got from her parents who had died many years before. She was the only person who was related to them. She didn't mind being alone. On the contrary, Naomi seemed to do best when she was alone, and friends who were looking for her only visited her once in a while. Knowing how to use plants and potions to heal different illnesses, the people in the area had a complicated relationship with her. Some people had a lot of respect for her, and saw her as the keeper of ancient information that had been passed down from generation to generation. Others stayed away, whispering that strange activities and rituals that had been seen at night had been seen near her land. There was still a lot of myth in the Appalachian Mountains at that time. Many people thought there was a line between traditional medicine and witches. People in the area thought it was weak and easy to cross. Along the mountain slopes in late September of that year, the first fall colors were just starting to show. 3 guys from Asheville came to the area. They were tobacco merchants traveling along the old Cherokee Trail to get to Tennessee. In the faraway places, they were looking for new business partners. The county seat, Marshall, is a small town where Samuel Hendris, Thomas Whitmore, and Jacob Patterson stopped to rest and get more food. It was there. That's how they first learned about Naomi Crowe. The owner of a local grocery store lightly mentioned a woman in the mountains who might be able to sell them some very popular herbs in big city markets. He said that Naomi grew rare types of American ginseng and other medical plants that were in high demand among doctors and apothecaries in cities. The 3 men saw a chance to make money. They chose to follow the trader's lead and climbed the steep paths that wound through pines and oaks that were hundreds of years old. The trip to Naomi's house took almost a whole day to clean. The paths were dangerous, not well marked, and thick vegetation often made it hard to see the right way. It was late afternoon when they finally found the cabin. The sun was already going down behind the mountains, sending long shadows across the valley. The building had a small front porch and simple but strong log walls that had turned dark from the weather. It was surrounded by well-kept gardens with dozens of different plant species, some of which were still doing well as winter neared. Naomi said hello to them, with quiet warmth. She looked like any other woman of the time. Her brown hair was pulled back into a simple bun, and she wore a dark, thickly woven dress that was fitting for work in the mountains. The 3 guys, on the other hand, saw right away that her eyes were very intense. She called them in, gave them tea made with herbs from the area, and paid close attention to their business plan. She agreed to sell some of her ginseng crop after some back and forth over a fair price that would work for everyone. Traders. Naomi suggested that they stay until the next day because she would need time to sort and pack the roots properly. They were supposed to leave in the morning. Also, it would be very dangerous to walk along the mountain paths at night. The men said yes to staying, and they set up camp next to the hut. Naomi made them a simple meal, which they ate as night fell over the mountains. The deep quiet that comes with being at a high elevation was broken only by the sounds of the forest in the distance. Something happened that night that would change the past of that area for good and leave a mark that would last for decades. Up to this day, no one knows the exact facts. But we know that when the sun rose over the Appalachians the next morning, things were different in ways that no one could have imagined. It was too quiet in Naomi Crowe's home. It looked like the traders' camp was empty, and in the nearby woods, secrets were starting to get buried deep in the damp mountain soil. Earth. As the weeks went by, none of the three men came back to Asheville as expected, which made their families worry. Letters and telegrams were sent back and forth between countries. In the end, the police were called. William Dockery, who was the sheriff of Madison County, put together a group to look into the missing. In the course of the study, many mysteries, contradictions, and new information would be found that would make people question everything they thought they knew. Knew about Naomi Crowe and the secrets that were buried in the Appalachians. Early in October, it was cold in Marshall, and fog was still thick and damp in the hills when Sheriff Docker's group left. 5 men, armed with guns and flashlights and ready for anything, followed the same path the traders had taken weeks before. As they drove, there was a tense silence as each man thought about what he might find on this remote land. Stories about. Over the previous few days, Naomi Crowe had grown, and as the songs went from bars and markets to taverns and markets, they got darker. At noon, when they got to the cabin, they saw something that scared them. The property looked like it had been abandoned totally. The wind made the front door swing a little, and the rusty springs made a noise. The herb fields, which used to be carefully taken care of, were starting to show signs of neglect. There were dry leaves all over the doorsteps. There were no signs of life and only the sound of the French Broad River can be heard far away, and crows can be heard calling from the trees nearby. As they got closer to the building, Sheriff Dockery told them to be careful, and each man gripped his gun tightly. The inside of the house showed a strange scene. Everything was back where it belonged, as if the people who lived there had just vanished while going about their daily lives. In the kitchen, the wooden table still had things on it. There was a clean bed in the bedroom, shelves stacked high with glass jars full of dried herbs, roots, and the walls were lined with different colored liquids. In a corner were a bunch of old books on herbs and traditional medicine. Everything looked normal, except that there were no people anywhere. No signs of fighting or conflict could be seen. There was only a strange stillness that filled every room like an unseen presence. The men looked through the whole house. A small shed was found at the back of the house. This is where Naomi had been processing and storing her crops. Roots of ginseng hung. From the ceiling in bunches, where they are drying slowly. More glass jars with labels carefully written in beautiful handwriting showed dozens of different preparations. A thick notebook bound in worn leather had detailed notes on recipes, the medicinal qualities of plants, and observations on how to grow certain plants. The yellowed pages showed years of careful work and were an important record of traditional knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation. A young man named Henry Blackwell, who worked for the sheriff's office, saw it. There was something strange by the river. There were marks in the wet ground that showed that something heavy had been pulled recently. The disturbed ground made a path that ran along the waterway and went through an area with lots of plants. As the group followed these marks, they became more scared and pushed aside low-hanging branches and prickly bushes that scratched their clothes. As they went, the sound of the river got louder. The stream was faster because it had been raining in the mountains recently, only 100 yards away from the house in A. It was in a small natural clearing bordered by weeping willows that they found something that made everyone there cold. 3 fresh-turned mounds of dirt were set up next to each other, with equal distance between them. Every mound was about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. Not a single cross, marker, or other mark could be found. There was only dark dirt and stones on top of it, probably to keep animals from digging up what was buried there. The group fell into a deep silence. Only the smooth flow of the river and the wind rustling the leaves break up the silence. Sheriff Dockery made a choice right away. Those mounds had to be dug up. No matter how horrible the job was, 2 men went back to the house to find the right tools. They came back with shovels they found in the shed. The work began in the weak afternoon sun. With each shovelful of dirt taken away, the anxiety in the air grew stronger. It was easy to dig because the ground was wet and packed down, but it also looked like it had already been dug. Not long ago, maybe days or weeks at most. It wasn't very deep, which could mean they were in a hurry or didn't have the right tools to dig deeper into the rocky dirt that is common in that mountainous area. Everyone reflexively backed away when the first shovel hit something solid that wasn't rock. Sheriff Dockery showed the guts that came with his job when he got down on his knees and started to dig up the ground with his hands. What came out proved everyone's worst fears. Dark tissue partly broken down by the "it's humid." After that, clear lines. These really were just temporary graves, and whatever was buried there shouldn't have been there out in the open without a ceremony or public record. Similar things were found in the other 2 mounds of earth. Together, they turned this remote area into the setting of a very scary story. Respectfully and carefully, the guys worked, mentally writing down every detail. Clothing that matched what the families of the missing traders said they were wearing. Personal things. That proved names. It was all there, hidden in that secret area on the banks of the French Broad River, in the shade of the mountains that had watched events in silence that had not yet been revealed. But everyone there had one question on their minds. What had happened on that farm during those September nights? Where was Naomi Crowe? It was only the beginning of the probe. Dockery knew he would need help from other people. He sent important telegrams to Asheville asking for the investigators with more experience and a trained medical examiner were present. While they waited for more help, they put up a guard on the property to protect the scene and keep curious people from messing with the evidence. The news started to spread quickly through nearby towns, as is typical for rural talk. There were many more ideas and new interpretations of Naomi Crowe's stories. People who knew her or went to her cabin looking for medicine became scared. In the Appalachian Mountains, where truth and superstition often mixed in ways that were hard to tell apart, this case grew into something bigger than just a criminal investigation. It turned into a story about the mysteries that old woods can hold, the gap between being a part of society and being alone, and how normal people can hide their true selves behind masks of normalcy. As night fell again on that cursed land, the men who were keeping watch couldn't help but look nervously at the shadows moving around. They could feel the weight of something much bigger than they knew. 3 days later, agents from Asheville showed up with better tools and more experience with complicated cases. A medical examiner trained at colleges in the northern part of the country, Dr. Edmund Pritchard, was given the job of looking at the results with scientific rigor. He was a middle-aged man who was very organized and strongly thought that logic was better than faith. Sheriff felt a little better when he was there. Dockery, who saw how things were getting out of hand as crazy stories spread like wildfire through the area. It took almost a week to search and analyze. Official notebooks were used to carefully record every detail, and heavy cameras that were very hard to carry up the mountain were used to take pictures. Dr. Pritchard did his tests in a makeshift tent that he set up next to the house. As night fell over the valley, he worked by the light of kerosene lamps. The first findings were scary but not clear-cut. The evidence suggested that the 3 traders had died right there on that remote land, but no one knew for sure what had happened. It wasn't clear that there had been any serious violence, no bullet holes or breaks from hard objects. In his preliminary report, Dr. Pritchard talked about the chance of poisoning because of the state of the tissues he could look at, and Naomi's known knowledge of plants. and what they're made of. A lot of plant types that could kill you if they were not cooked properly grew in the Appalachian Mountains. People in the area knew about water hemlock, belladonna, foxglove, and snakeroot, and Naomi definitely knew about these dangerous plants. While the forensic work went on, other officers looked through the cabin again for signs of Naomi Crowe's whereabouts. Her plant notebook was taken away as proof after they found it. On the pages were not only medical recipes, but also what seemed to be toxicology findings. Suspicious amount of information. There were notes about the exact amounts of some plants that were used, how they affected different living things, and how long the effects lasted. There were people who thought it looked like the work of a careful expert. Others thought it was the diary of someone who was learning how to hurt others. The search for Naomi spread all over the area. In Marshall, Asheville, and other smaller towns spread out across the hills and mountains, posters with her description were put up. Sheriff Dockery set up a system. The trails that lead off the land were searched, and every possible route she could have taken was followed. Volunteers walked miles of rough terrain, checked out natural caves that were known to local hunters, and looked into abandoned houses that were spread out in the mountain's more remote areas. However, Naomi seemed to have disappeared totally, being sucked into the forest she had known so well her whole life. As more witnesses came forward, they each brought pieces of information that made the whole picture even more difficult to understand. A farmer. A few miles away said that for several nights in a row, about 2 weeks before the sheriff arrived, he saw smoke rising from Naomi's land. He thought it was strange because Naomi usually didn't use a lot of coal and didn't keep big fires going. According to a woman from the town of Marshall, Naomi had gone to the local grocery store a few days before the merchant went missing and bought a lot of food, much more than she usually did, for their own personal use. Another very interesting story came from a salesman who went around the mountains selling tools and home goods. He was sure that he had met Naomi on the main track about 5 days after the traders had been last seen alive. Based on what he said, she was walking quickly west toward Tennessee while carrying a big bag on her back. Naomi answered quickly when he said hello, but she didn't stop to talk, which he thought was strange because Naomi usually did, friendly to the few travelers who went through those out-of-the-way roads. Because of this knowledge, investigators decided to look in areas other than Madison County. Tennessee police received telegrams describing Naomi and asking them to keep an eye out for any other women who looked like her. But because the Appalachians are so big, this was almost impossible to do. Thousands of square miles of mountains, dense forests, and remote valleys where whole towns lived almost without being linked to each other from other places. Someone who wanted to hide could easily get lost in that huge space. As the searches went on without finding anything, the town was in a lot of trouble. A lot of people who had gone to Naomi for medical help started to wonder if she had poisoned them or influenced them in some other way. People who had bottles of the medicine she had made started to feel scared. Some people threw them away right away, either by burning the whole bottles of medicine or throwing them into the river. Others, who were less sure, said that Naomi had never hurt anyone in the neighborhood in all the years she had lived there. This split caused a lot of stress. Families that used to be friends started to fight over what Naomi Crowe really was. Some people thought she was a victim of events they didn't fully understand. They thought she might have been protecting herself from traders who were trying to hurt her in some way. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had carefully planned everything by using what she knew about. Evil plans to do bad things. Most of the time, the truth lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. Dr. Pritchard finished his official report at the end of October. It was about a gray area where people's intentions and situations are complicated. He was careful in his conclusions because he knew that decay and the way the evidence was found had some limits. It was impossible for him to say for sure what killed the person, but his research strongly suggested that. Risk of poisoning from plant-based chemicals. If Naomi Crowe was found, he said she should be held right away, and asked a lot of questions about what happened on his property that terrible September week. Friends and family of the 3 traders who went missing came to North Carolina to claim their bodies and make plans for proper funerals. It was clear that they were sad and angry that they didn't have clear answers about what had happened to their loved ones. They called for justice and put pressure on the authorities to look more. Newspapers in bigger towns wrote shocking headlines about the mountain woman who had gone missing after 2 mysterious deaths. This brought attention to the case. As Naomi Crowe's story was told over and over again, new dramatic details were added that were further and further from what was known to be true. But Naomi was nowhere to be found. She was like a ghost that had decided to disappear into the mountain mist she loved so much. She didn't leave any signs of where she was for. Investigators to find her, and as winter came and brought snow and bitter cold to the Appalachian highlands, the chances of finding her living dropped with each passing day. The Appalachians were hit by an unusually harsh winter in 1913. Snowstorms blocked trails, cut off towns, and hid secrets under thick layers of ice and white noise. When it got really cold, the search for Naomi Crowe had to be put on hold because it would be too dangerous to go on long mountain trips. Deputy. In the winter, Dockery occasionally checked on the property, but even these trips became less common as the cold weather got worse. On the bank of the French Broad River, the cabin was empty. Its dark windows looked out into the valley like they were looking at nothing. During those cold months, the story became real to the people who lived there. Families would meet around roaring fireplaces on long winter nights to talk about Naomi Crowe's case over and over again. It looked like everyone had their own idea or way of interpreting what happened. Some adults remembered old stories about wise women who lived in the mountains and kept secret information from people who weren't from Europe. These stories were from before Europeans came to the area. For them, Naomi's disappearance meant the end of an age because she might have been the last of a long line of women. Some people made guesses about the sellers themselves. Who were those 3 men anyway? More research in Asheville showed that Samuel Eckris had a past of gambling debts. Thomas Whitmore was blamed, but never guilty of stealing a few years ago. Jacob Patterson was the only one of the 3 who didn't have a known shady past. He was a family man who was just trying to make more money through trade. These new details made people wonder what their real goals were when they went to Naomi's remote property. Had they really only come to trade herbs for medicine? A businessman in Marshall told Sheriff Dockery about an interesting event not long before Christmas. He thought back to when the 3 men came to his. At the grocery store, they asked him specific questions about Naomi that he thought were odd at the time, but hadn't thought were important enough to bring up before. What information did they want to know? Did she live alone? Did she have family close? And did she keep money or other valuables on the property? The merchant responded in a naive way that Naomi had been living alone for years, and that her family had left some land and maybe some savings behind. This new information changed everything about the case. Could the traders have been planning to rob? Namo? Could she have done something to protect herself if she knew what they were planning? If the woman had been using self-defense, the case would go from a possible planned triple murder to a tragic case of a woman protecting her life from attacks. But there were big problems with this idea. Why hadn't Naomi called the police if it was self-defense? Why did she bury the dead in secret and then run away? Why was there no sign of a fight or other violent incident on the property? When asked again about these issues, Dr. Pritchard kept his careful stance. The physical evidence he looked at just didn't let him come to a firm decision. The body's breakdown, the passage of time, and the fact that it wasn't stored properly all worked against accurate forensic analysis. In a private letter to the sheriff, he said that the case really upset him, not because of the technical parts, but because he knew that he could never know the truth. There were only 4 people there. On that land during the important events. There were 4 of them. 3 were dead and the 4th had vanished. When spring finally cleared the last of the snow and brought new life back to the mountains, the search began again with even more determination. During the winter, new hints had shown up. In November, a woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, said she took in a lost tourist. A woman who looked a lot like Naomi and who paid for her food and shelter by teaching others how to use healing herbs. The tourist said she only stayed for 2 nights before leaving, planned to get to the plains of Kentucky. With this information, police went in that way, but the trail quickly went cold. Others said they saw them in a variety of strange places. Someone said they saw her working on a farm in southern Virginia. Another person said that a strange woman showed up for a short time in a remote mountain town in Georgia and offered medical help before disappearing again. Each report was carefully looked into, but none of them led to real results. Naomi Crowe, is she really alive? She had become a master at staying hidden, moving through the rural South like a shadow and leaving only stories behind her. People became interested in Naomi's property for strange reasons. People were pulled to the scene by the case's fame, which made them curious. Some people were just interested in the puzzle. Others were thrill-seekers looking for scary things to do. The sheriff had to put up signs warning of trespassers, but he couldn't keep an eye on such a rural area all the time. There were reports of stories start to spread about strange things happening in the abandoned cabin, like seeing lights through the windows at night and hearing sounds that can't be explained. The facts of the case became mixed up with superstitions that mountain people always had on hand. It was very upsetting what happened in April 1914. Because of the macabre stories, a group of young adventurers from Asheville chose to camp near the land. In the middle of the night, they were sure they heard a woman singing an old tune somewhere in the woods nearby. When dawn came, they went into the house and saw that the front door was open, even though they were sure it had been locked the night before. Inside, there was a fresh ivy leaf on the kitchen table, as if it had been planned there. The young people ran away in fear and told the police what happened. Sheriff Dockery looked into it himself and found no recent signs of people living there besides the young men's tracks. Any animal or person could have brought the ivy in, wind through the door that was only partially closed, but the event led to rumors that Naomi sometimes went back to her old home at night, maybe to look for lost things or just to visit the only place she had ever called home. This chance led to more attempts to trap her, with men hiding nearby and waiting for her to come out. All of these tries wasted nights and didn't lead to any captures. Things kept going for most people. In the end, the families of the traders who died, that they could never get all the answers. In civil court, they sued Naomi's estate to get money for the harm they caused. The judge finally ruled in favor of the plaintiffs while the defendant was not present. The property and its goods were given to them as partial payment, but no one really wanted that cursed land. The house was left empty and was slowly taken back by the nature that had always been there. The case slowly fell out of the news over the next few months. People were interested in other stories and disasters as well. When the First World War started in faraway Europe, it caused so many problems that a small puzzle in my own area seemed like nothing. But for those who were personally affected by what happened, Naomi Crowe's case was still fresh in their minds, an unanswered question that kept them up at night. Sheriff Dockery didn't publicly close the case because he didn't want to say that Naomi was dead or give up hope of finding her and finding out the truth. The next few years brought deep, changes for the whole country. The Great War cost a lot of lives and a lot of resources. It also changed American society in ways that no one could have imagined. Young men from the Appalachians marched to fight in wars abroad, leaving behind communities that were getting older and less populated. The world was changing quickly, and small local secrets seemed to belong to a different time, to a past that was quickly becoming a thing of the past as the 20th century moved forward with its relentless modernity. But in Marshall, in the places she lived in, Naomi Crowe's story would not die. It was part of the local legend and was told over and over again with different details. Some people saw her as a cold-blooded killer who killed 3 men who weren't guilty. To others, she was a victim of terrible events who had to fight for her life. And for a third group, she was almost like a mythical figure. A woman who knew all the secrets of the mountains and still roamed the woods, watched over them from afar. Land where she used to live. In 1918, something very strange took place. A message from Louisville, Kentucky, was sent to Sheriff Docker's office. The writing was beautiful and clear, and it was done in black ink on white paper. The letter wasn't signed, but it seemed very likely that Naomi Crowe wrote it. The text was short and mysterious, and it was clear that each word was chosen with care. The author said they knew a lot about what happened in 1913, but they didn't say they were guilty or give detailed explanations. Simply put, they said that the truth was more complicated than any investigation could show, and that some things should stay hidden. Sheriff Dockery spent all night reading that letter over and over again, trying to figure out what each vague sentence meant. He sent detectives to Louisville, but they couldn't find anything. The postage stamp only gave a rough idea of where the woman was, and in that big of a city, it was impossible to find someone who didn't want to be found. The letter was kept by him. His personnel file, which was a physical reminder that the crime had not been solved. He would say that letter upset him more than any physical evidence found on the property along the French Broad River years later, when he finally retired. The letter brought up important issues about justice and people in general. If Naomi was alive and free somewhere, living under a different name, would that be a terrible wrong, or just a recognition that we would never know the whole truth? The justice system is based on proof and of evidence. What happens, though, when the evidence isn't clear and all the witnesses are dead or missing? What should a society do when there are mysteries that can't be solved? The few people who were still really interested in the case talked about these philosophical questions. While the 1920s were going on, the Appalachian region went through big changes. Better roads started linking communities that had been separated before. Electricity slowly made its way to rural areas. Voices and music from far away could be heard in homes through radio. Groups of mountain people who had lived alone for a long time. People who heard about Naomi Crowe's cabin and decided to visit were sometimes just interested in what was left of it. It got worse and worse as time went on. As the walls and roof fall apart, nature takes back every inch of the land that was once farmed. People didn't want to build there. The place's bad reputation kept people who might have wanted to buy or live there away. There were many reports of ghosts, but most of them were probably just the work of overactive imaginations. Imaginations, along with the sounds of a building falling apart and wild animals that had made the area their home. But these stories had a reason for being told. They kept the memories of what happened in 1913 alive and made sure that the questions would not be forgotten by the fast-moving hands of time. In 1925, 12 years after the original events, an investigative reporter in Charlotte chose to look into the case again for a series of articles about North Carolina crimes that have not been solved. He stayed in the area for weeks, talking to anyone who remembered what happened. He found that there were a lot of contradictions and different ways of looking at things. Everyone had a different idea of who Naomi Crowe really was. Anybody who knew her seemed to have dealt with a different part of her personality. Some people thought she was nice and generous, while others thought she was strange and quiet. It was said that she was very lonely. Someone else said that she seemed happy being alone. The reporter also found information that hadn't been. It's well known. A neighbor who lived far away remembered that Naomi had casually said she felt watched, as if someone were watching her from afar, months before the terrible events. She never said more about how she felt, but she did seem genuinely upset. Someone else remembered that Naomi had asked how to tell the police about someone who was trespassing. These pieces of her memories made me think that she may have known danger was coming, but hadn't done anything to protect herself. What the reporters. During the summer of 1925, articles were published one after the other, briefly rekindling public interest in the case. People from all over the state sent letters to the newspaper. Some people came up with very detailed theories, while others told personal accounts of meeting strange women who might have been Naomi but were using other names. Each story was interesting, but it was impossible to confirm them. The line between truth and fiction was so fuzzy that it was almost impossible to tell them apart. A very interesting development happened. From a retired doctor in Raleigh who read the stories and got in touch with the reporter. He told the story of a patient named Sarah who came to see him around 1916 and showed a great deal of knowledge about herbal medicine. She worked briefly as his assistant and was very good at making medicines. He said the woman he described looked a lot like Naomi Crowe, but it had been almost 10 years, so he knew his memory could be wrong. After a few months, the woman was nowhere to be found, leaving only a thank you note. She thanked him for the chance and told him she needed to move on. If this story is true, it sounds like Naomi not only got away, but also started a new life, or several lives, moving from one place to another whenever she felt like people were asking too many questions. That way of life would require constant alertness, loneliness, and the inability to make lasting connections. What kind of mental damage would living in such a world do? How could someone stay sane if they lived on the edges, hidden forever, always looking over their shoulder? Just like in the real case, the journalist's articles ended without a clear answer. He thought Naomi might still be alive somewhere. She was a woman in her 40s who might be living under a different name in a place where no one knew her story. Or maybe she had died years ago from an illness or accident in a remote area where her body would never be found or identified. Both options seemed like they could happen. We could never be sure which was true. The Great Depression made things even worse in Appalachia, which was already used to poverty and hardship. Mines and farms shut down, and whole families moved to cities to find work, which they rarely found. When a lot of people were feeling down, ancient mysteries seemed like niceties from a better time. There wasn't much time or money to think about things that happened almost 20 years ago. The Naomi Crowe case slowly faded into the background. Deeper layers of collective memory are sometimes talked about, but not as much as they were in the beginning. The cabin was gone, leaving only a few rotting logs and stone foundations that were overgrown with thorny plants. Nature seemed set on getting rid of any physical signs that Naomi Crowe had ever lived there. The herb gardens she had worked so hard to grow were now part of the forest. When the French Broad River kept flowing forever, it didn't notice the human dramas that were going on around it. Took place on its banks. Only the oldest people could still remember the exact details, and even their memories were getting fuzzy because the story had been told so many times in different ways over the years. He was 72 years old when he died in 1936. Any private information he may have had about the case he took with him. A nephew who was there says that he said something on his deathbed about the mountains having secrets that men shouldn't look for. It's not clear if he was talking about Naomi Crowe in particular or making a more general comment about how the Appalachian Highlands are. His replacement as sheriff wasn't interested in cold cases. Instead, he focused on the immediate problems of keeping order during hard times for the economy. During this time, including among women in the area, a new way of looking at Naomi Crowe's story began to take shape. She was no longer seen as a criminal or a victim. Instead, she was seen as a sign of something bigger. A woman who had lived on her own and had useful information but hadn't given in to social pressures to get married and have children. At a time when women still didn't have many choices, especially in rural areas, Naomi showed them another way to live, even if it ended in tragedy. The darker parts of the case were still there after this new interpretation. The story was still mostly about the deaths of the 3 traders, but some women started to question what they thought they knew about what had happened. It happened. If the men had really come to Naomi's house to do her harm, like rob her or something worse, then wouldn't it make sense that she would react the way she did? At the time, the laws didn't do much to protect women who were alone in these situations. Official justice didn't always see the real dangers women faced, especially when they lived alone. Most of these talks happened in kitchens and porches, where women could be alone and not be bothered by men. There was no record of these talks whether they were newspapers or official records. They changed the way history was taught to new generations in small ways. Mothers told their daughters different versions of the story that focused on different parts that brought up questions that were not covered in the main stories. What gave strangers the right to show up on a woman's property? Why hadn't more people asked the merchants about their intentions? Why was Naomi automatically thought to be guilty even though the evidence wasn't clear? When the country was at war again in 1942, during the war, an old woman in a Tennessee veterans hospital told a nurse a strange story. She said she knew the truth about Naomi Crowe because they had been friends in the past. She said that Naomi had actually defended herself against the traders who tried to attack her when they found out that she had hidden a lot of money in the cabin. She made hasty choices she couldn't take back because she was afraid no one would believe her as a woman accusing 3 men of a crime. The nurse. She wrote down this conversation in her own notes, but she didn't report it to anyone else. The old woman died 2 days later without giving any more information or proof to back up what she said. There was no way to know for sure if she had met Naomi or if she was just telling one of the many stories going around. Even though there was a lot of conflicting information about the case at the time, the nurse kept her notes and gave them to a local historian decades later. The 1940s. Appalachia went through even bigger changes in the 1950s. Electrification projects in rural areas changed places whose infrastructure had stayed mostly medieval. Even the most remote valleys started to get TV, which showed pictures of the outside world that seemed more and more different from the local ways of life. An increasing number of young people were leaving the mountains to find work in cities. The area was becoming empty, old, and disconnected from its own past. Nicole. Crowe's story might have been lost forever, turning into a strange tale that only a few people know about. In 1958, though, something very strange was found. In Lexington, Kentucky, workers tearing down an old hotel found a small metal box with personal papers inside among the rubble. There was a death certificate for a woman named Sarah Meadows that was laid to rest in 1931. She was 46 years old. There were photos and a letter that had never been sent, written in handwriting that experts say would later find that might match Naomi Crowe's writing samples. The letter was written to no one in particular. It was a confession or a personal reflection that the writer may not have meant for anyone else to see. The author wrote about a life that was always on the go and where they could never really rest or make lasting connections. She said she felt terrible about things that didn't matter, but she insisted she had only done what she had to in order to stay alive. The lack of clarity persisted even in this, potentially, document that shows. There was neither a clear admission nor a denial of murder. There was only the sadness of someone who had lived for decades with a burden she could never fully share. The discovery brought some new attention to the case for a short time. Retired detectives and local historians looked over the papers for hours, arguing about whether they were real and making guesses about what they meant. But not even this possibly important piece of evidence gave clear answers. What if Sarah Meadows had? If she had really been Naomi Crowe, she would have been able to get away and live for another 18 years, under a different name before dying of what seemed to be natural causes. However, the link was never proven beyond a doubt. It stayed in the realm of possible guesswork. This case was already very mysterious, but now there's even more to it. After decades of research, guesswork, and new interpretations, it became clear that we would probably never know the absolute truth about Naomi Crowe and what happened in 1913. The mountains were very good at keeping their secrets, and the people who were there had gone to unmarked graves or lived anonymous lives after telling their stories. There were only pieces, vague clues, and the many stories that people had made up to fill in the blanks because there were no solid facts. In the 1960s, a new generation became interested in American history stories that had been forgotten. Many young historians were moved by the civil rights movement and the call to question official stories. They started looking at old cases again, with a stronger mind. Margaret Thorne, a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, became interested in Naomi Crowe's case and decided to write her dissertation on it. It was about justice and gender in the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1900s. Margaret carefully looked into the case for 2 years, visiting county archives and historical libraries and talking to the children and grandchildren of people who knew Naomi or were involved in the original investigation. What she found out was telling not only about the case itself, but also about the larger social situation in which it happened. In the early 1900s, women who lived alone were automatically seen with suspicion in the Appalachian Mountains. A woman who lives alone, owns property, and practices medicine without having any formal training. All of this went against deeply held social norms. Margaret found old newspaper articles from that time that had been missed by previous investigators. Articles talked about Naomi using language, slurs, and bad rumors even before the events of 1913. People often called her the strange woman of the mountains, or the lonely medicine woman, which sounded like they didn't think much of her. Some articles made it sound like she did witchcraft or pagan rituals without any proof. This news coverage showed deep-seated biases that would have affected any decision made if Naomi had been caught and put in jail. Even scarier, Margaret found out that Thomas, one of the 3 merchants who had died, Whitmore was charged with more than just robbery in the past. He was also charged with assaulting a woman in Asheville. The charges were dropped in a strange way, and there were rumors that the family of the victim was paid to drop the case. The original investigators had never properly researched this information or thought it was important. The idea that Whitmore might have wanted to hurt Naomi had been completely ignored in favor of stories that made her sound like an attacker. When Margaret finished her dissertation in 1968, it was a complete rethinking of the case. She said that Naomi Crowe probably acted in self-defense, and that the traders who came to her property with the intent to commit a crime. She also said that Naomi's extreme response was understandable because she was alone and facing 3 men, and she knew that the court system at the time would probably not believe her story. Margaret didn't say that Naomi's actions were okay, but she put them in context in ways that other investigators had missed. A lot of people didn't like Margaret's work. Some people saw it as too much historical revisionism, or trying to apply modern values to things that happened in the past. Others welcomed it as an important way to fix past wrongs done to women. As always, the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. However, Margaret's work changed the way Naomi Crowe's story was told for many years afterward. She gave birth. By adding color to a story that had mostly been told in black and white, they made people think about things they would have rather ignored. In the 1970s and 1980s, people in the Appalachian region became more interested in their own history and culture. There was a movement to value and keep mountain traditions alive. It included traditional music festivals, oral history projects, and keeping old crafts alive. In this situation, Naomi Crowe's story came up again and again, appearing in local folklore collections, community radio shows, and even a play put on by an Asheville community group. Each time the story was told, it added new layers of meaning. Some artists drew her as a tragic heroine who was stuck in impossible situations. Others kept her morals vague, making her seem like a complicated person whose actions were hard to judge. One version that really got to me, a folk song written by a local musician, wasn't about the violent events, but about Naomi's loneliness and her strong bond with the mountains. Her skills were passed down through generations of women whose voices haven't been heard much in official history. In 1985, 72 years after the events that started it all, one last important thing happened. A very old woman in a nursing home in Nashville called a local newspaper and said she was Naomi Crowe's granddaughter. She said that her grandmother had indeed run away to Kentucky, married someone under a fake name, and had a daughter who had grown up not knowing who her mother really was. Who you are. This daughter told her own daughter the truth only on her deathbed. The woman, who is now 90 years old, chose to tell the story. Journalists looked into these claims in great detail. Some of the woman's details matched what was known about Naomi, but other parts of her story could not be checked. When family records were looked at, they showed mistakes that made her claims seem less likely. Like so many other parts of this never-ending case, genealogy experts couldn't come to a conclusion. It was still not possible to tell with. No way to know for sure if the woman was telling the truth, was wrong, or was just trying to get attention or make a connection to a famous story. The supposed granddaughter, on the other hand, told the story from Naomi's point of view, passing it down through 2 generations. This story says that the traders did attack Naomi after finding out that she had hidden a lot of money in the hut. She fought very hard, using her knowledge of plants as the only weapon she had. She made tea with herbs she knew would kill them, but they gave it to the men and said it would help them sleep after a long trip. They agreed without any doubt. It was too late when they realized what was going on. In this story, Naomi was so shocked by what she had done that she couldn't fully understand what she had done for a few days. In a panic, she buried the bodies, grabbed the few things she had left, and ran away. She was scared that no one would believe she had acted to protect herself. She moved around a lot her whole life. Place, feeling very guilty and sure that she had no choice but to do what she did. Naomi was dying at the end of the story. She was crying over the men she had killed, and the years of her life she had lost because of one terrifying moment of violence and fear. It was an emotional and powerful story. It brought closure that decades of investigations had not been able to bring. But was it real? There was no way to be sure. It stayed in the gray area between fact and fiction, like everything else about Naomi Crowe. Stories, facts, and the need to know the truth. The Appalachians had been keeping their secrets for 70 years, and it looked like they still weren't ready to let them go. Based on the few records of Naomi Crowe's life that have been found, the 1990s were close to the 100th anniversary of her birth. As we entered a new century, people thought about how old stories still affect people today, shaping regional identities and keeping important questions about justice, memory, and truth alive. Nearby, a group of historians put together a series of talks and exhibits about unsolved murders in Appalachia, and Naomi's story naturally played a big role in these talks. For the remains of the case, a new generation of researchers, armed with tools that earlier investigators could never have imagined, tried to use modern methods. Digitizing and enlarging old photos revealed details that couldn't be seen before. Paper and ink forensic techniques were used to keep and look over old documents. Some researchers even used metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to go to the spot where the cabin used to be, in the hopes of finding something that people in the past might have missed. Some interesting but not conclusive results came up in these searches. Small pieces of metal that could have been tools or things used around the house. Glass pieces from old jars, which may have been the ones Naomi used to store her herbal mixtures and animal bones that caused a brief frenzy before being identified as the remains of local. There were many forums, but none of them could finally answer the main questions about what happened on those terrible days in September 1913. The most obvious thing that these modern investigations showed was how fragile historical memory is. After 80 years, it was almost impossible to tell the difference between fact and fiction. There were so many versions of the story going around, and each one affected the next, that it was impossible to tell what the original sources were. It was like trying to see through murky water. You could make out rough shapes, but never could quite nail down the details. In 1997, an independent documentary filmmaker made a movie about the case. They talked to the victims' children, local historians, and experts on past crimes. The documentary did not try to give a clear answer because it knew that there probably wasn't one left. Instead, it looked at how communities tell stories about traumatic events and how these. Over time, stories serve different social purposes, and ambiguity can be more telling than certainty when it comes to understanding how people work. People whose families had lived in the area for generations were interviewed in an interesting way for the film. One older woman remembered that Naomi's grandmother, who had only known Naomi for a short time, always said she was a nice person who would never hurt anyone without a good reason. A man whose great-grandfather had been a part of the first search said that in the investigation, Ancestor thought that something important had been missed, a key clue that no one had seen at the time. The interview with a modern herbalist who worked in the area and carried on traditions that went back hundreds of years was more moving. In Appalachian societies, women who knew how to use medicinal plants had always had a tricky place. They were respected for their skills, but also feared for how powerful they were seen to be. This information was a kind of authority that did not depend on male institutions, which had always made people feel uncomfortable. She said that Naomi Crowe had been hurt by both specific events and broader cultural worries about women who don't follow traditional social norms. At the end of the documentary, there was footage from today showing the spot where the cabin used to be. The forest had taken back the whole area. In places where gardens used to be, tall trees grew. The French Broad River kept flowing forever, and its clear water showed off the Appalachians. Sky. It was a peaceful and beautiful scene that didn't show anything about the terrible things that had happened there decades before. The movie made it seem like nature heals all wounds, hides all evidence, and turns tragedy into a peaceful landscape. Around the turn of the century, the internet started to change how old stories were kept alive and shared. Online groups that talk about unsolved crimes and historical mysteries brought the Naomi Crowe case back to life. People all over the country, many of whom had nothing to do with Appalachia, talked about their ideas and shared their research. Some people looked for the supposed granddaughter's children and grandchildren who had shown up in the 1980s. Others looked for records of Sarah Meadows that could either prove or disprove the link to Naomi. Genealogical lines were traced, obscure historical documents were digitized, and information from different sources was put together in impressive ways by these online communities. But they also showed that mysteries could be almost fun to read. Not having the real. They had a lot of emotional weight for those who were directly affected. It was simple to guess when you were at home, thousands of miles away, and didn't have to deal with the results or remember everything with other people. People who saw or knew about the Naomi Crowe case in the early 2000s, long after the original witnesses and participants had died, turned it into a regional legend. It was still told, but there was an underlying sense that it would never be solved. There were no unclear. No longer problems to be solved, but important parts of the story itself. The story was about what we can't know, the limits of justice and inquiry, and how normal people can end up in situations that are so out of the ordinary that they can't be judged by simple morals. Some local school teachers use the case as a way to teach about critical thinking, analyzing sources, and spotting bias. It wasn't used to teach about crime, though. Students looked at documents that seemed to contradict each other and judged the reliability of different accounts and learned that history doesn't always give us the answers we want. It was a useful lesson in a time when people are becoming more divided and dogmatic. Naomi Crowe's story showed us that reality is often more complicated than our simple stories let us see. A memorial service was held near the site of Naomi's old homestead in 2013, exactly 100 years after the events of the first event. There were only a few dozen people interested in local history and preservation at the event. They didn't mean to judge Naomi or the merchants. They just knew that something important had happened and that lives had been lost and changed in deep ways. They chose a native walnut tree as a memorial tree. They hoped it would grow tall and strong and live for another 100 years, being a silent witness to a story it could not tell. Not just Appalachia, but the whole world went through huge changes in the decades after the centennial. The digital age sped up communication between even the most distant places, from small towns to worldwide computer networks. Young people who would have stayed in the mountains a generation ago can now move to cities with unprecedented ease. The region had to deal with the problems of preserving its culture while also accepting that it would have to become more modern. In a world that was always changing, old stories like Naomi Crowe's took on new meaning as ways to define who people were in the area. Not so much the events of 1913 themselves, but how history had been made, became the focus of historians and anthropologists. Changed and passed on for more than 100 years. The changing stories and how each generation retold history in ways that showed their own concerns and values were looked at in the academic thesis. In the 1920s, crime and justice were very important. In the 1960s, issues of gender and power came up. The 2000s were all about ambiguity and the fact that we can't know everything for sure. A very large project was started in 2018 by a group of researchers from different fields. They put together an extensive digital archive that has. They looked for and found every document, newspaper article, recorded interview, and academic study that was related to the case. The archive was put online so that anyone who wanted to could look at the evidence and come to their own conclusions. It was a huge shift toward democracy in history, recognizing that truth belongs to everyone who looks at the evidence seriously, even if it can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Patterns in the archive were very interesting. It showed how some versions of history had dominated at certain times, how different voices had been shut down or pushed to the side, and how evidence that didn't fit preferred stories was often ignored. It showed how history is made. It's not found all at once. It's put together from pieces by people with their own limitations and points of view. During this time, the Appalachians became a more popular place for historical tourists to visit. People came from all over the world to hike the same trails. Naomi walked to see Marshall in Asheville so she could feel some of the mountain air that had shaped this history. Businesses in the area started giving tours that focused on crimes and mysteries that happened in the past but haven't been solved in the area. Naomi Crowe's case was always brought up. and as groups walked to the site of the old homestead, her story was told in a dramatic way. People in the community had a lot to say about these tours. Some locals thought it was okay for tourists to learn about the area's history, even the darker parts of it. Things. Others didn't like how tragedy was turned into a product for sale, or how real pain was turned into entertainment for strangers. There wasn't an easy way to solve the tension, which was a reflection of how unclear the case had always been. How should society balance the need to remember the past with the need to show respect for those who were directly affected? During the global pandemic of 2020, when everyone was forced to stay inside because of it, many people thought about loneliness in new ways. Crowe's Naomi's. The story had an unexpected effect on me. This woman had chosen to live alone, but her solitude turned into a prison when she had to hide from everyone forever. Podcasts about crimes from the past brought up her case again, and many of them pointed out similarities between what she went through and how people today feel trapped and alone. A very well-researched podcast made a 10-episode series that went into great detail about every part of the case. The makers of, as time and money allowed, they went all over Appalachia and talked to local historians and the descendants of historical figures. They also got opinions from experts in forensic botany, trauma psychology, and criminal justice history. The podcast surprised everyone by getting millions of downloads and rekindling interest in the case among a whole new group of people. The end of the podcast was purposely left open-ended. Multiple plausible theories were put forward by the producers, and each was backed up by a subset of the. There is evidence. They let people come to their own conclusions, knowing that after more than 100 years, there could be no absolute certainty. But they made it clear that ambiguity did not mean that all possible interpretations were correct. There was more evidence to support some theories than others, and it took some thought to tell the difference between wild speculation and a reasonable conclusion. The popularity of the podcast sparked new interest in academia. Several universities held conferences about the case. Look at it from the points of view of ethics, history, criminology, gender studies, and rural sociology. These academic events not only gave us useful information, but they also showed us something very important. The basic facts of the case didn't change, no matter how advanced the tools used to analyze it were. There were strange things going on when 3 men died. A woman was no longer there. Everything else was a matter of opinion. Each level of analysis shows more about the analysts than it does about the events themselves. During this time, there was a growing movement in Appalachian communities to change the way stories from the area were told. Many of the young people who spoke out went to universities far away, but chose to return to their roots. They questioned traditional stories and looked for more inclusive ways to keep collective memory alive. They said that stories like Naomi Crowe's shouldn't just be read for fun or to learn more about someone, but should be taken seriously because they show that everyone involved is human. During this move, came up with new ways to tell the story. Local artists made installations with reconstructed objects, recordings of forest sounds, and copies of Naomi's botanical notes that let visitors experience parts of her life. They didn't try to make things more dramatic or shocking. Instead, they wanted to make room for thoughtful reflection on how complicated people's lives are and how hard it is to make quick decisions. It was very different from the sensationalist stories that had been told before. Ruled for many years. Local writers also started to write fiction that was loosely based on the case. They weren't trying to write about real events, but rather used history as a starting point to look at universal themes. Being alone, staying alive, and the knowledge that women have passed down through generations. The connection between people and the natural world. They didn't solve the mystery, instead, they made it more complicated. turning it from a puzzle to be solved into a reflection on what it means to be human. This was a sign that some stories are more useful for what they ask than what they say. In 2023, 110 years after the original events, a small museum in Marshall that focuses on Appalachian history decided to make a permanent show about unsolved crimes in the area. The case of Naomi Crowe naturally figured prominently. The exhibition was carefully curated to avoid sensationalism, featuring original documents, period photographs, and balanced analyses of different interpretations. It also included a section on how the story had evolved over the decades, making the process of historical construction itself part of the narrative. Today, more than a century after that fateful September of 1913, the Appalachian Mountains continue to guard their secrets with the same silent tenacity as ever. The French Broad River still flows through the valleys, its cold, crystal-clear waters bearing witness to generations of human stories unfolding on its banks. The forest where Naomi Crowe's cabin once stood has grown dense and impenetrable, each ancient tree a silent sentinel of events whose details will never fully reveal themselves. The truth about what happened in those distant days remains as elusive as ever. Decades of investigation, analysis, speculation, and reinterpretation have failed to penetrate the veil that separates fact from mystery. Perhaps it should never have been otherwise. Some stories resist resolution, not for lack of evidence or investigative effort, but because they touch on something fundamental about human nature that defies simple categorization. The Naomi Crowe case has become much more than an unsolved criminal investigation. It has become a mirror in which each generation sees reflected its own concerns, values, and limitations. For some, Naomi remains a shadowy figure, someone who crossed fundamental moral lines and then fled the justice she deserved to face. For others, she represents a victim of impossible circumstances, a woman who defended her life in a world that offered minimal protection to people in her position. For others still, she is simply too human to be reduced to binary judgments of guilt or innocence. Someone who made desperate decisions in moments of extreme terror and then lived with the consequences for the rest of her days. What we know for sure is remarkably limited. We know that 3 men traveled to a secluded property in the North Carolina mountains. We know they never returned alive. We know that Naomi Crowe disappeared shortly after these events and has never been definitively located again. Everything beyond these basic facts dissolves into a haze of possibilities, each plausible, but none provable. The motivations, the exact actions, the precise sequence of events, all remain obscured by time and the absence of reliable witnesses. The surviving documents paint a fragmented and contradictory picture. Letters that may or may not have been written by Naomi. Testimonies from people who knew her, but whose memories have inevitably been distorted by rumor and time. Physical evidence that suggests multiple interpretations without definitively confirming any. It's frustrating for those seeking closure, but also a valuable lesson about the limits of what we can know about the past. Appalachian communities have learned to live with this fundamental ambiguity. Naomi Crowe's story has become part of the region's identity, told and retold in ways that evolve with each generation. It is no longer just about the events of 1913, but about how communities process trauma, construct shared narratives, and grapple with questions of justice and memory. It is living history in the truest sense, continually reinterpreted in light of new concerns and perspectives. Visitors to the region today can hike the same trails Naomi once walked, gaze upon the same mountain formations she knew intimately. The terrain has changed less than one might imagine. The roads are better. Communication is instantaneous, but the fundamental essence of the mountains remains. There are still valleys where silence is almost absolute. Forests where dense vegetation creates darkness even at midday. Places where it's easy to imagine how someone could disappear completely if they truly desired. The small museum in Marshall maintains its exhibit on the case, updated periodically as new research emerges or perspectives shift. Local students visit as part of their regional history curriculum, learning not only about specific events, but also about how history functions as a discipline. They learn to question sources, recognize biases, and accept that not all questions have definitive answers. These are lessons that transcend this. Particular case, preparing them to navigate a complex world where absolute certainty is rare and nuanced. Thinking is essential. Periodically, claims of new evidence or newly discovered connections still emerge. Someone finds an old letter in the attic of a deceased relative. Someone else finds a record in a cemetery that might or might not list Naomi under a different name. Each new discovery sparks a short burst of interest, careful research, and eventually the realization that no matter how interesting it is, it doesn't really change anything. We should change what we know or don't know. The mountains keep their secrets too well for yellowed pieces of paper to be able to open them. After more than 100 years, we still know that this story is important, not because it gives us answers, but because it makes us think about tough questions about justice in societies where power is not shared fairly, about how being weak can make people do desperate things, about the duty of communities to look out for their most vulnerable members, about the courts can only do so much to reveal the truth, about how shared memories are made and kept alive across generations. Nobody can give you a simple answer to these questions, but every society needs to keep asking them. Her story isn't over because it can never really end. Through direct or indirect means, she affected the lives of many generations. People who are related to the traders who died are still alive and carry a burden of loss and unanswered questions. People who live in the area now grew up there. They hear different versions of this story, which changes how they see the world and their place in it in small ways. What history isn't just about is the past. It's also about how the past shapes who we are and how we understand our communities. It might be right for some stories to stay mysteries. Not everything needs to be fully explained, categorized, and archived. There is value in ambiguity because it helps us see that people's lives are often more complicated than our stories would have us believe. Nicole. Crowe's story reminds us of how complicated things are and challenges us to say no to quick judgments and sure things. It's a gift from the past to the present, if we are smart enough to accept it. The Appalachian Mountains are still there. They are old and haven't changed in their core, but the details on their surface are always changing. In their valleys and slopes, they have seen civilizations rise and fall and a huge number of human tragedies. Naomi Crowe's story is just one of many like it. The mountains hold, and like the mountains, the story stays true to its basic shapes while being shrouded in clouds that never fully clear. If this story moved you in any way, or if the questions it brings up match up with what you think about justice, truth, and people, you might want to subscribe to this channel. There are many more stories from Appalachia and the rest of the United States that have yet to be told. Each one has its own lessons and mysteries to be solved. Leave a comment with your own thoughts on this. A very unusual case. Also, think about liking it if you think stories like this should be kept alive and told with care. It is important to remember the people who came before us, not to judge them, but to learn from their mistakes and pass on their stories.